Hey there, I'm Dr. Vivian Lowe. You're on VLMD Rounds, a podcast on medical science and tools to optimize your health. The other day, I was talking to my friend Sean Bierk, and Sean is a dancer and performer and teacher. He teaches house dance in the Boston area. Fabulous performer, fabulous dancer, and really an excellent teacher. So if you're thinking of taking up dance classes, especially house dance, you should go to Sean's classes. I am one of his students and I love his class. I'm going to leave his contact information so you can look him up, all right? So I just was looking at Sean and he didn't seem his usual self. Normally he's just, full of energy, very, active, bouncing around. And he just seemed quieter than usual. So I said, "Hey, Sean, how are you doing? You okay?" And he said, yeah, today's the first day I'm kind of feeling more like my usual self. So let me give you some backstory here. Sean had just finished, organizing an entire festival, a dance festival, 2-week festival. And this meant that prior to the actual festival, he had to get, everything in order. We had dancers, performers, teachers coming from out of state, from as far away as Brazil. So it was a big deal, right? And it was a packed festival. We had, lots of intensives and workshops, classes, exhibitions, demos, and we even had dance battles. And those of you in the dance world will know this is when, different dancers will kind of battle or compete with each other. So this required getting judges involved and so forth. So it was a big deal. You can imagine it was a huge amount of work. And also, Sean was entertaining people from all over the world. And so you can imagine he didn't really get much rest in that time period, right? So, he said to me at that point, I was wondering, Viv, how does lack of sleep impact athletic performance? And I thought, just as I was about to answer, I thought, hey, what a great episode. Okay, I could do a whole episode on sleep and athletic performance. So, Sean, this episode is for you. I hope you find it useful. We're going to dive right into it. Let's go. I just want to mention that I already have an episode on sleep, and that's just kind of a general episode on sleep. Okay, this one we're going to dial down on how it impacts athletes. Now, I am very much, interested in athletic performance. I have danced most of my life, and I think that dance is really one of the most physically demanding activities, right? You have to have everything, if you're going to be a dancer. You have to have power and endurance, speed, strength, agility, right? Balance. And then you have to have memory to keep all that choreography in your head. And then on top of that, you have to have spatial awareness because you're generally dancing with other people. And then there's the artistry in dance, right? So there are just many components in there that make it highly challenging. And so I've always been interested in how lifestyle behaviors impact our athletic performance. Now, when I looked at the literature, it was startling to see that actually most athletes across the board are struggling with sleep, okay? So there's a very high rate of sleep disturbances in athletes. There was one study here that showed a high rate of sleep disturbances in college athletes. 42% had poor sleep according to the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the PSQI. Now, on this index, if you scored 5 or higher, then you basically had pretty poor sleep. And as I said, 42% of athletes actually had a score of 5 or higher. Furthermore, 38% of them slept less than 7 hours, and greater than 50% had symptoms of excessive daytime sleepiness. So they were really dragging during the day. Now, the International Olympic Committee in 2019 came out with a statement that sleep actually impacts athletic performance and mental health. It's a bit of a duh statement, but nonetheless, I'm glad that they're recognizing how sleep is, really a big part of being healthy for athletes. And we're seeing more studies on sleep and elite athletes. Nonetheless, as I said, the common theme is, they don't do very well with sleep. They struggle with getting enough sleep, especially with high training loads. So, for example, there was one study looking at elite swimmers, and they had an average of 5.4 hours on nights before training. And then they had about 7 hours on rest days. So you can see it fluctuated depending on whether they had a rest day or a training day. Now, with elite football players, they slept 2.6 hours less after a nighttime match compared to daytime matches. So if they had a game at night, then they actually slept quite a bit less, 2.6 hours less. And it was 3 hours less than after a regular training day. Okay, so really marked reduction in sleep if they had nighttime matches. And, then a lot of athletes struggle to make up the sleep. Obviously, they try to get some naps in, but, naps don't always solve the problem. Now, it seems like, again, the higher the physical workload, the harder and heavier and more intensive the training, the less sleep they have. Now, that's obviously the time when you need the most sleep, right? Because if you're training intensively and then you're having more muscle damage, for example, then you need more time for recovery, and yet actually they tend to sleep less. Now, this sleep loss increases risk of injury, and that's not very surprising. If you're going to last as an athlete, as a dancer, you know that you have to keep in tip-top condition, and of course everyone wants to avoid injury because that's just going to impact your body and how long you can be in your sport, right? But we need to start thinking of this more when we're looking at our athletes who are our patients. You sleep less than 8 hours per night, and you're 1.7 times more likely to get an injury. Now, there's a pattern to this, right? Basically, we see about 1 week before the person actually gets an injury, we start to see a pattern of decreased sleep efficiency and increased latency to falling asleep. All right, that means that they're having a harder time falling asleep. And also, when we talk about sleep efficiency, this is just essentially the percentage of time that they really are asleep while they're in bed. Okay, a normal is like 85%. So when you're in bed, you want to spend the majority of your time at night in bed asleep. And if you have poor sleep efficiency, then you're going to have more time awake, right, than actually sleeping. So 1 week prior to injury, we already see people have difficulty in falling asleep. So there's an extended period of time before they fall asleep, and they have decreased sleep efficiency. So they actually spend less time in sleep, even when they're lying there trying to sleep. All right. So across the board, again, they have lower sleep quality, lower sleep latency and efficiency compared to non-athletes. All right. There was a study here by Turner et al., and they reported in 2019 that 60.9% of college athletes have excessive daytime sleepiness at least 3 days a week, and 1/3 had really a lot of sleepiness to the point where they couldn't stay awake at least 3 times a week. So they were literally just dropping off and falling asleep. And when they are given more time to sleep, when you actually say here, we lessen your training schedule maybe, and you give them more time to sleep, they're still struggling because, as I said, they still have the lower sleep efficiency and lower sleep latency. So it's taking them much longer time to fall asleep. And there are many reasons for this. Of course, this depends on their training schedule, and if they're college athletes, then they have their schoolwork, and that's factored in. But other athletes, for example, may have their jobs that they still have to tend to. So Olympic athletes, for example, they still have to have full-time jobs and have a training schedule, right? And then they have travel involved if they're competing, time zone changes and so forth. And then they're, dealing with competition and stress and anxiety. So there are all these different things that come into play that may disturb their sleep. Now, aside from the fact that they are having less number of hours, they're taking a longer time to fall asleep, and then, they're having less sleep efficiency, which essentially means they probably wake up more too, right? There are also circadian aspects. So when we are talking about circadian rhythm, what we're saying is sort of the day-night cycle. And all of us have this internal day-night cycle rhythm in our bodies. And generally, for us to function well, we need to be in sync with those circadian rhythms in our body. But when we have shift work, for example, or let's say we travel to different time zones, then you're going to have jet lag. Okay, and you can be sure that this is going to affect performance negatively. And there have been studies that looked at how well, for example, different teams did when they had circadian rhythm shifts, when they had jet lag. And it turns out that they tend to not have wins, right? They tend to be losing when there is some circadian disruption there. Also, some of these competitions can end pretty late. So I was in a martial arts competition way back, and my events fortunately were in the afternoon. But as a group of us were getting ready to leave, I saw other people from the same martial arts school, and I said, "Aren't you done?" And they had their events at 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. So that's pretty late. So you can be sure that they were probably not going to get home, before midnight at all. And they were still going to school. So those of them that had to stay that late. They were really high school students. So I can imagine just what a disaster it was for their sleep, right? So you have these competitions that end very late, and sometimes, the training schedule too can be very late. So those of you in the dance world, you know that a lot of the classes happen at night, and we all struggle with that. I know we all moan and groan because as much as we love those classes and the training, it can take a toll on your sleep. All right, so with the circadian change, right, the greater the number of east-west time zones that are crossed, the worse it's going to be for the athlete. Okay, and even just being in the plane is going to impact the sleep. So a short flight up to 6.5 hours or a long flight greater than 30 hours, doesn't matter. You're on that plane, and that itself will give you more fatigue. It'll prompt you to have earlier wake times, and you're just kind of not going to have as much energy, right? So when we look at jet lag, right, they last about 1 day per time zone cross when you're going east, and about half a day per time zone going west. So it really depends on which direction. It's a bit more when you're actually going towards the east, and a little bit less, but even then you have a time shift there, all right? So 1 day per time zone cross, and then half a day per time zone for going west. Okay, there's not maybe so much difference going north and south as you might think, right? Because after all, north south, same time zone in all likelihood. But guess what? There's differences in light exposure, and light exposure is really important with circadian rhythm, your day-night rhythm, okay? So if you're going further south, then you're getting more light exposure, let's say going towards the equator, and then further north, of course, you're getting less light exposure. And, you can go back to that sleep episode and review that, but we've talked about how light can really set your circadian rhythm, right? And so you're going to have disruptions even if you're going north-south because of the light difference. And then there are just what we call non-photic aspects. Non-photic meaning non-light aspects of your rhythm change, and this would be related to things like timing of your meals, okay? So when you eat, and also when you exercise. So it turns out that when you exercise in or train in the evening, right, 1 hour of evening exercise will shift your rhythm, right, 30 minutes later. So there's what we call a phase shift. And now you're going to basically have a later sleep time, later time of melatonin onset. So again, from the sleep episode, I talked about melatonin and how your brain makes this hormone in the absence of light. But if you are actually exercising, at night, 1 hour of evening or night exercise is going to shift the melatonin secretion from your brain about 30 minutes later. So you have that phase shift, right? And, if you're going to actually exercise in the daytime, in the morning or early afternoon, then it's going to shift it earlier. So you actually get sleepier or ready for sleep earlier, right? So really, when you exercise is going to have an impact here. All right, when we look at the sleep deprivation effects, they're really hard to assess because, again, different studies looked at different types of sports. So, whether it's endurance sports or power sports, right? It's really hard to kind of compare apples to apples when you're looking across the board at different types of athletic, events and athletes, right? Also, there are differences in men and women and team versus individual sports. So it's kind of a mixed bag here when we looked at the studies. However, in general, you're probably not surprised to know that we saw decreased running performance, for example, decreased strength and muscle glycogen content. So there's decreased energy stores in the muscle and decreased strength. And then there's decreased isokinetic peak torque and minute ventilation. So your physiology is different. Decreased distance covered, so you can't go as far. Decreased sprint times and tennis serve accuracy, soccer kicking, and also decreased time to exhaustion. That meant you just got exhausted much sooner. On top of that, mood disturbances, right? Poorer mood and just lack of vigor, lack of motivation. Turns out that just 2 to 4 hours less sleep per night would lead to these changes, and we could see changes in reaction time, judgment, decision making. Very important in many sports, right? So if you're in soccer, for example, you have to make quick decisions as to who to pass the ball to, for example, right? And you have to react very quickly. Let's say you're a tennis player, right? Table tennis, anything like that, right? So we see these changes happening when you have just about 2 to 4 hours less sleep per night. Okay, so not huge amounts of sleep deprivation, not quite like, only sleeping 3 hours per night, but already you could see differences. There were metabolic differences as well. As I said, with disruption of the circadian rhythm, you're going to have more cortisol levels in your blood. So this is a stress hormone. And so we're going to have increased cortisol levels in the blood. And guess what? This is going to lead to a catabolic state, because now your body says, you know what? I'm struggling, right? Physiologically, I just need more energy. And so we start actually breaking down tissue to try to support that energy. Now, most athletes don't want to be in too much of a catabolic state, because if that were the case, you're going to start losing muscle, right? And that definitely is going to impact your performance. So, again, people don't think about this, but the longer you stay up, then the more likely you are to be in a catabolic state, breaking down tissue in your body, especially muscle, right? And that would impact your performance. There's also increase in obesity and diabetes or insulin resistance. You're going to have increased cravings for unhealthy foods and impairment in glucose sensitivity, okay? So people who are having less sleep, they tend to have less restraint as well, right? Decreased judgment also, and they may pick unhealthier foods. For your immune system, we see increased pro-inflammatory cytokines. Those are the signals that immune cells send out, right, to kind of rev up the immune system. And as a result, we're going to impede muscle recovery and repair. So when you're working out, when you're training, when you're in a game, for example, in a competition, and you're using those muscles, you're actually damaging the muscle tissue. And we need to have enough time during sleep for repair to occur. Now, if you have a lot of inflammation going on still when you're in your recovery period, then you're not going to get the repair that you need, right? So it's quite common to see overtraining in conjunction with lack of sleep. And in fact, a lot of people will look at sleep to kind of gauge whether that athlete is in an overtrained state, okay? Which means that they're in a state of increased stress, increased sort of sympathetic tone, so they're constantly like pumping out adrenaline, and this is huge stress for the body. And also then it impacts their pain perception, and they have poorer cognitive measures, so and the mood is worse, so they struggle a lot more and they're not able to give their best. All right, now I want to specifically talk about contact sports. And hopefully we know by now, all of us, that with contact sports, the more likely you are to have any traumatic event or traumatic injury to the brain, right? That's going to increase your risk of dementia. Now, if you add to that lack of sleep, just lack of sleep on its own is going to increase your risk of dementia. But if you take an athlete in a contact sport like American football, for example, right, then they're going to have more likelihood of brain injury. And in order to recover from traumatic brain injury, we really need to prioritize sleep. And a lot of times, The coaches wait for clearance for when the athlete might go back to training. And we really have to factor in whether the athlete has been able to recover his or her sleep properly. Now, what happens during sleep? Actually, your brain makes a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And this is very important. And we used to think that the brain just kind of floated in this CSF, but it turns out that actually this fluid is kind of going through the brain, almost like pumped through the entire brain, right? And rinsing it out and washing it out. And what is it washing? It's actually washing out toxic proteins that have accumulated in the brain. So if you have an injury and you have inflammation in your brain, then you have accumulation of toxic proteins. And when this fluid is perfusing through the brain, it's actually rinsing out those toxic proteins, right? And then it's bringing it eventually to the blood supply. Okay, so we're getting these proteins out of the brain. But here's the catch. This only happens during sleep. So when you're awake, when you're up and about, that's not going on. Okay, so this actually brain rinse or brainwashing, right, occurs only during sleep. And so if you're not sleeping, you're not adequately washing out these toxic proteins, and that is related to increased risk of dementia. And there are lots of people now who are thinking that, this impairment here, this lack of sleep and lack of the ability of your brain to wash itself contributes to Alzheimer's disease. All right, so now we have all those athletes who may have, some concussion, big or small events, and a lot of times they may have little traumatic events that they're not even aware of, right? And if they're not having enough sleep, then they're really not able to clear the brain of these toxic proteins. And then they increase their risk of more inflammatory changes in the brain, ultimately leading to dementia, when they're a little older. Okay, so in those athletes in contact sports with high incidence of traumatic brain injury, not only do we see more dementia, but they are getting those symptoms earlier on in life. So very important to prioritize sleep. And one of the big questions before we give clearance to them to go back to training is just to make sure that they have rested their brains enough. And this also means that they have slept enough. Okay. All right. So what other things do we see in athletes? Sleep apnea, okay, especially in certain sports, those that prioritize strength and power, and maybe high contact sports as well. And I definitely noticed this in my patients who are restless or were restless. Okay, so I don't know why, but restless seem to have, just in my experience, right, a lot of them have sleep apnea. It could be just because of the way they're built, they have the thicker necks and so on, right? So whatever their build is, that might kind of make it advantageous for them to do that sport. That also may be compromising their sleep in terms of sleep apnea. So we see this with NFL players, so American Football League, right? And then hockey players as well. And so again, contact sports, a lot of strength and power involved. And the bulkier these athletes are, the better, maybe the less injury they get, but it may also impact their sleep. So the key here is that we need to be assessing them for sleep apnea, and we just need to be very attentive, because a lot of times we'll look at these athletes and they don't look like, they kind of look healthy and lean, right? So you wouldn't think of sleep apnea, but like I said, I see this a lot in the wrestling population, right? A lot of my patients who are restless or were restless, I mean, they can look very lean, but they may also have sleep apnea. There are other sleep disorders that are also related to athletes. So, for example, restless legs. Apparently, 13% of runners have restless legs, and then periodic limb movements, 12% of rugby players, right? So, we see a lot of these sleep disorders in elite athletes. Okay, so now that I've told you about how athletes sleep, all right, let's do a very quick wrap up, and then I want to focus on what we should do, what we should prioritize when you're actually training hard. Okay, so again, generally we know that athletes have poor sleep, they don't sleep enough in terms of time, and then they have difficulty falling asleep, and they also have more arousal, they're waking up more, therefore their sleep efficiency, the amount of time spent actually being asleep in bed, that goes down. Right? That's the general rule. And when we look across the board, I mean, it's quite bad. You know, they're averaging about 6 hours, but some athletes are going lower than that even. So, you know, they're not getting the rest for their muscles, for example, for their bodies. They're not getting enough recovery time. They're going to have metabolic disruptions where they're in a primarily catabolic state. They have circadian disruptions, right? And this means that they have less vigor and poorer performance with their sport. Okay, so what are we going to do? If you're an athlete, generally most people, we want adults to sleep about 7 to 8 hours. If you're an athlete, 8 to 9 hours, okay? Prioritizing actually the 9 hours. Most studies seem to suggest we should be closer to the 9 hours. I have to admit, you know, even I balked at that because I was like, 9 hours of sleep. Okay, this is going to majorly change my schedule, right? But it looks like, you know, the more sleep you have, if you're training hard, the better. What about naps? Okay, naps, you know, could be helpful, but the problem sometimes is that they're too long or they're scheduled at the wrong time. So too long would be maybe greater than your 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So if you're going to have a nap, maybe about 20 minutes, okay? And then the other thing is you don't want to have your nap too close to your actual night sleep time, because that's definitely going to interfere with your sleep. Now, that's very common because a lot of my patients will tell me, well, I can't sleep. And then only to find out that, you know, they were asleep on their couch 2 hours before their sleep time. Like, no wonder you can't sleep, all right? So you just want to watch the naps. There's this concept now of banking sleep that's kind of popular in the sports world. And the idea is that, you know, if you know you're coming to a period where you might have some sleep deprivation, then actually you can prepare for it by sleeping more ahead of that period. So you're kind of banking the sleep. And there's some studies that show improved motor performance if you do that. So I think there's a lot of interest now in studying that. It's not across the board, right? But a lot of people are feeling like at least if we bank some sleep in advance, we might mitigate some of the damages, right, later on. Now, with circadian aspects of sleep, the day-night cycle, right? General rules apply. You have to make sure that you have proper exposure to light during the awake hours, right? And you want to make sure that at night you have good sleep hygiene, use I always advocate a sleep mask, a really good sleep mask to block out the light. You want to decrease the use of devices, so stop being on your phones and on your tablets and your computers, right? And you just kind of want to default to a quieter routine at night, a sleep routine. Now, lots of athletes have to travel for their events, their competitive events. So we're going to have to think about that ahead of time. Generally, the advice is to start working on your circadian shift about 2 days prior to actual travel. Okay, so 2 days before you actually fly, you already want to kind of make some adjustments in your schedule. Now, there are these jet lag calculators that a lot of people use. And, I'll see if I can put one, give a link for that so you can look it up, right? And you actually just put in, where you are and where you're going, right? And put in the dates and stuff like that. And then it'll kind of tell you, how to adjust your exposure to light. So that can be very useful, and you want to start doing that about 2 days before you actually travel. When you get to your destination, then presumably that's where you're competing, right? So you want to adjust straight away. So once you're there, you want to get on their meal schedule. You want to really have exposure to natural light, especially when it's daytime in that location, right? And then go to bed when it's nighttime in that location. So you're going to try and immediately adjust and follow the day-night cycle there. And this goes for meals as well. So don't forget that your circadian rhythm is very impacted by the timing of your meals. So as soon as you get to the new location, you want to follow that location's meal times. And in addition, you're going to have to plan out your exercise and training time. All right, because again, I told you about how exercising at different times in the day would impact your, circadian shift, right? So if you are going to, exercise at night, you're going to shift later. So if you're, exercising earlier, you're going to shift earlier. So it makes sense, for example, I'm in Boston. If I'm going to the West Coast, then it makes sense to actually kind of work in the exercise that at night on the West Coast, right? And that would shift my sleep time later because it would work with the time zone change, right? So you want to think these things through. The other thing is, as an athlete, and hopefully your coach will be on board there. They should by this time, right? Now we're more aware about how sleep impacts your performance. You don't want to put too many events in there such that you're traveling so much and you have very, very fragmented sleep and you're not even able to shift. All right. So going from one time zone to another, in very short periods and having a lot of those events, that's something we have to watch out for because it's going to lead to overtraining as well, right? And that's just going to negatively impact your performance. Generally, you want to have a good sleep routine. So besides blocking out the light with the sleep mask, just having a routine where you are actually unwinding about 30 to 40 minutes before you actually plan to go to sleep, right? And you can use maybe things like quiet music and do a body scan and so forth. It turns out that athletes actually struggle a lot with insomnia, and this might be just the nature of their personalities. They tend to be very driven, and maybe there's a lot also of anxiety or stress related to the event that's coming up. Maybe they're worried about different aspects of their training, and there might be a certain level of perfectionism as well. So that seems to make it harder for them to fall asleep. So many athletes do have insomnia, and they're challenged by that. So you want to find a good routine to help you unhook right? And whether that's doing a body scan, doing breathing exercises, listening to calm and quieting music, you're going to have to work something into your routine. Okay, I want to say a special word about athletes that tend to train high, okay, altitude training. You know, depending on the type of sport and also, at what level you're at in your sport, right? But the very elite athletes, they sometimes will work in altitude training. And the whole idea is if you go to some high mountaintop somewhere and you train there where the partial pressure of oxygen is less, right? Then first of all, you have a higher blood volume, you have more red blood cells, right? To help you get oxygen. And if you acclimatize to that and you have a higher blood volume, then when you eventually compete, let's say closer to sea level or at a lower altitude, you'd have an advantage. Okay, so that's the whole idea, is that you'll have a competitive advantage if you actually trained in a high altitude or lived in a high altitude and then went to your events at lower altitudes. Okay, but we have to think about how that might impact your sleep as well. Because a lot of times people are thinking it's going to be a competitive advantage, but not necessarily if it impacts your sleep. So we've seen with healthy mountaineers, okay, these are healthy people that go like trekking or something like that. There was a reduction in sleep time, sleep efficiency, and deep sleep. This is the non-REM stage 3 and 4 sleep, okay? So they actually had less sleep time, less sleep efficiency, and less deep sleep. And there were significantly increased numbers of arousals, woke up a lot more, right? And pronounced periodic breathing. What is periodic breathing? This is a kind of breathing where there are pauses and then there are quick breaths, like very irregular quick breaths following the pause. So what does that remind you of? People with sleep apnea. So these are healthy mountaineers. They don't have sleep apnea, but when they actually go to higher altitudes, this is what we find. So there's a change, right? And the higher up you go, the more likely you're going to see these changes. You're going to see more of the reduction in sleep time and reduction in sleep efficiency and less deep sleep. You're going to have more arousals and more of the periodic breathing. So if you're someone who is going up, high to train, and you're periodically doing this, don't forget that maybe the first couple of days, maybe even up to the first week, you're going to have these changes in your sleep, right? And that's going to impact your body as well. So a lot of times people might have a regimen where they're training 4 weeks at higher altitudes and then they come down and then they go to an event or something like that. But you think about it, in those 4 weeks, maybe that first week as they're adapting and they have all those changes in sleep, that's kind of like a week lost, if you know what I mean, right? So we definitely need to take that into account. Furthermore, the contact sports athletes, right, that have sleep apnea, they absolutely need to make sure they have their CPAP with them to make sure that, they have, less obstructive sleep apnea when they're at the higher altitudes. Because remember, you get this increase in periodic breathing as well. Okay, now, one last thing I want to point out here. This was a study by Bloomberg et al. In 2023 in Lancet. This was looking at exercise and sleep. And basically the idea is we always think that the more exercise you have, the more active you are, the more intense you exercise, right? That's going to have a benefit in terms of your cognitive function, and it's going to improve it, and maybe you're less likely to have cognitive decline. That's a general idea there about how physical activity and exercise helps your brain, right? Well, this study looked at healthy adults from England, and it was a longitudinal study of aging. So this was over a period of 10 years. And they had 8,900 plus participants here. So what they did, they followed these people. And it turned out that when they compared people with high levels of exercise and physical activity and decreased sleep, right? Compared them with people who were also very active but had optimal sleep, those with decreased sleep had a faster rate of cognitive decline, right? And it turns out that 10 years out, these people had the same rate of cognitive decline as those people who didn't move at all, who had very low physical activity, and who had any kind of sleep duration. So whether they had poor sleep or good or optimal sleep, if they didn't move very much, they had a good amount of cognitive decline. But if you were active, very active and high levels of physical activity, but you had decreased sleep, it was just as bad as the people who didn't move at all. The reason I say this is a lot of times I get asked by patients. They go, well, I was planning on going to the gym at 4 a.m. in the morning. Oh, what time did you go to bed? Oh, midnight. Yeah, but I want to get in my exercise because I know that's good for me. And I really want to say, well, if you're only sleeping 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, I don't know how much benefit you're going to get from the exercise. Obviously, I want people to preserve muscle mass and so forth, right? But we already saw that you're more catabolic anyway, right? If you're not getting enough sleep. So, I would say make sure your sleep is in order first. So all of you who are my friends who are dancers, I know we're all going deep groan at this point because those night classes, right? And it's really hard to unwind after class. So sometimes we finish as late as 10 and we're still all revved up. And it's really, really hard to unwind. But we got to find some way to do that. We got to find a way to just kind of come down from that, get that sleep in, extend the morning hours maybe. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Sean, this episode was for you, and I hope you got a lot out of it, and everyone else too. If you have questions for me, then I'd like to invite you to my live Q&A sessions. If you want to ask me about sleep or how you can optimize your sleep, then feel free to drop in on one of those sessions. I have that up on my website, when the next one is. And also, if you'd like to work with us to help you optimize your sleep, if you're an elite athlete or just any kind of athlete and you want to optimize your sleep, drop me a line. My website is vivianlohmd.com, VYVYANELOHMD.com. Okay, that was it for today. So signing out from VLMD Rounds, I'm Dr. Vivian Loh, and I sing the body electric. Till next time, bye.